The arena of Cathar Prime was ancient beyond counting, and its walls had seen 10,000 duels. Across 10,000 cycles of the twin suns that burned in the violet sky above. But today, something different stood in its center. Commander Vexala of the Serani Dominion watched the creature with all four of her eyes, and she could not understand what she was seeing. The human was small and soft and pale, and he wore no armor at all. He simply stood there in the middle of the sacred sand with his arms hanging loose at his sides, and he watched her right back with those strange two eyes that humans had. Vexilla circled him slowly, and her four powerful legs carried her in the pattern of the ancient predator dance that her people had used for hunting since before they had built their first cities. In her clawed grip she held the ceremonial javelin called the Verkash, which meant spear of binding in the old tongue. The weapon had been forged in the heart of a dying star, according to the legends, and the ancestors themselves had blessed it with power that went beyond the physical world. She had carried this spear for 200 years, and she had thrown it 73 times at enemies, who stood where this human now stood. 73 throws and 73 kills. Not one single opponent had ever survived the Verkash. Crowd around them numbered in the thousands, and they filled the stone seats that rose up in circles around the arena floor. Vexala could hear them breathing and shuffling and whispering to each other about the strange soft creature that had violated their sacred hunting grounds. Above the common seats sat the elders, in their thrones of black obsidian, and their ancient eyes missed nothing that happened. Below, the human shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, and Vexala felt something strange prickle along her spine. It was a warning from her hunting instincts, and those instincts had kept her alive for 400 years. But that was foolish, because this was just a human. The intelligence file said that humans were soft and slow and weak, and their lives were so short that a Serani child would outlive 3 generations of them. There was nothing to fear from such a creature. And yet he stood there looking at her with no fear in his eyes. Vexala had seen many beings face the Verkash over the centuries, and all of them had shown fear in the end. Some had tried to hide it behind false courage, and some had wept and begged, and some had simply frozen like prey animals caught in the open. But this human showed nothing but calm patience, as if he was waiting for a shuttle or standing in line for food. It made no sense. The human spoke, and his voice was steady and even slightly bored. "I know the rules already," he said. "Your people explained them to me very thoroughly for about 6 hours." A ripple of shock and anger passed through the crowd like a wave. "No." One interrupted a commander of the Dominion. "No." One of Vexala's secondary eyes narrowed to slits, and she felt her crest of feathers rise with irritation. "You dare to mock our traditions," she said, and it was not really a question. "No," the human said, and he shifted his weight again in that small way that made her instincts scream warnings she did not understand. "I am just ready to get this over with because I have people waiting for me back on my ship." The human's name was Thomas Reeve, according to the crude translation of the markings on his gray uniform. Was something called a sergeant major, which seemed to be a rank of some importance in the human military structure. His ship had strayed too close to the sacred hunting grounds of the Serani 3 days ago, and her patrols had captured him and brought him down to the surface for judgment. By the ancient laws, he had the right to face the trial of spears. If he survived, he would go free. If he fell, he would feed the sacred sands with his blood, and his body would be left for the desert creatures to consume. No human had ever faced this trial before. No human had ever been foolish enough to enter Serani space without permission before. This one of Vexala tightened her grip on the Verkash and felt the familiar hum of its ancient power against her. "Scales, you stand accused of violating the sacred boundary," she announced in her formal voice that carried across every corner of the arena. "By the laws of our ancestors, you face the trial of spears and the judgment of the Verkash." She began to circle him faster now, and her muscles coiled with 4 Centuries of training and experience. If you somehow survive, you will go free with the blessing of the Dominion. She continued, if you fall, your blood will water the sacred sands, and your name will be forgotten. The human Thomas Reeve just stood there and watched her move around him. Did not try to run or dodge or prepare any kind of defense. He simply waited. Vexilla felt that strange prickle of warning again, and she pushed it aside with irritation. This was just a humana. Soft, weak, short-lived human who had wandered into the wrong part of space and who would now pay the price for his foolishness. She stopped her circling and planted all 4 of her legs in the throwing stance that she had practiced 10,000 times. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. By blood and star, Veshafale intoned the ancient words. By claw and fang I cast my challenge upon you, intruder. She drew back her arm and felt the familiar weight of the Vokash as it prepared to fly. Catch my spear, she said, and by the law of Vokash you may claim your prize. Her muscles tensed to their maximum and power flowed through her body like lightning. Fail, she finished, and feed the sacred sands with your life. She threw. Vokash left her hand at a speed that would have been invisible to most species in the known galaxy. It was a perfect throw, and the spear spun in a deadly spiral that she had refined over 200 years of practice and 73 successful kills. The point aimed directly at the human's heart, and it would punch through his soft flesh like it was made of water. Vexilla was already beginning to turn away because she did not need to see the impact. She knew exactly what would happen next because it happened 73 times before. The spear would strike, and the human would fall, and the crowd would cheer, and that would be the end of it. But the sound of impact never came. Instead, she heard a gasp from the crowd that seemed to suck all the air out of the arena, and then silence. A silence so complete and so absolute that Vexilla could hear her own heart beating in her chest. She turned back to look at the human, and her world stopped making sense. The human Thomas Reeve stood exactly where he had been standing before. He had not moved or dodged or fallen. He had not died. Instead, he stood there with the Verkosh clutched in his right hand. He had caught the uncatchable spear. He had done the impossible thing that no being had done in 6,000 cycles of Sarani. Veshafale felt her legs grow weak beneath her, and she staggered back a step without meaning to. That is not possible, she heard herself say, and her voice sounded strange and far away. The human looked down at the spear in his grip, and he seemed almost surprised himself. The ancient weapon hummed with power and glowed faintly in his hand, as if it recognized something in him that Vexilla could not see above them in the obsidian thrones. One of the elders rose slowly to its feet. This elder was ancient beyond measure, and its scales had faded to pale gray, and its movements were careful and deliberate with the weight of countless years. When it spoke, its voice rolled across the arena like thunder from a storm. The law is fulfilled. Vexilla spun toward the elder and felt panic rising in her chest for the first time in centuries. No, she said, and she could hear the desperation in her own voice. There must be some mistake or some error in what we have seen. She pointed at the human with a shaking claw. He must have cheated somehow, she insisted. Some kind of human technology or hidden device that let him do this impossible thing. There is no error, the elder said, and its voice was as final as death itself. The Verkosh was thrown by your hand, Commander Vexilla. The elder paused and looked at the human who still stood there holding the sacred spear, and the Verkosh was caught by his. The elder finished. The law of binding is absolute, and it has been fulfilled this day. Vexilla felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, and she struggled to understand what was happening. In the center of the arena, the human Thomas Reeve lowered the spear and looked up at her with those strange 2 eyes, and in that moment, everything Vexilla had ever known about herself and her place in the universe began to crumble into dust. The arena had descended into chaos, and the sound of thousands of voices all speaking at once filled the air like the roar of an angry ocean. Vessela stood frozen in place, and she could not make her body move, no matter how hard she tried. Her mind kept replaying the same impossible moment over and over again. The throw had been perfect, the spear had flown true, and the human had simply reached out and plucked it from the air like it was a toy tossed by a child. "What is happening?" Thomas Reeves said, and his voice cut through the noise of the crowd. "What is this law of binding that everyone keeps talking about?" Vexala could not answer him because her throat had closed up and no words would come out. The elder above them raised one ancient claw and the crowd slowly fell silent again. "You do not know," the elder said to the human, and there was something in its voice that might have been surprise or perhaps dark amusement. "You caught the Verkosh without knowing what it would mean." Thomas looked up at the elder, and his face showed confusion. "But no fear. Your people did not explain this part during their 6 hours of explanation," he said. "They told me about the trial and the spear, and what would happen if I failed to survive, but nothing about any law of binding. Then I shall explain it to you now," the elder said, "for it is your right to understand what you have claimed." The ancient Serani leaned forward on its obsidian throne, and its pale eyes fixed on the human with an intensity that made even Vexala shiver. "In the time before time, when our people were still savage hunters on the plains of the first world, there lived a great warrior named Verkosh," the elder began. "She was the mightiest of all hunters, and none could stand against her spear." The crowd had gone completely silent now, and even the children in the upper seats had stopped moving to listen. One day Verkosh challenged a rival from another tribe, and she threw her spear with all her might. The elder continued, "But the rival caught the spear in midair, and Verkosh knew in that moment that she had met someone stronger than herself." Thomas listened carefully, and Vexala could see him processing the words and trying to understand where this story was leading. Rather than fight and die against a superior foe, Verkosh chose to pledge her life and her service to the one who had caught her spear. The elder said, "She became bound to her rival forever, and together they built the first great tribe that would one day become the Serani Dominion." The elder gestured at the spear still clutched in the human's hand. "That is the very spear that Verkosh threw all those millennia ago," the elder said, "and the law she created on that day still stands as the most sacred and unbreakable bond our people know." Thomas looked down at the weapon, and his eyes widened as he began to understand. "You are saying," he said slowly, "that because I caught this spear, I have somehow gained ownership of the person who threw it. Not ownership alone," the elder said. "The bond goes deeper than mere slavery or service, and it cannot be compared to such simple things." The elder rose fully from its throne and spread its arms wide. "Commander Vexala is now bound to you in all things," the elder proclaimed. "Her life belongs to you, and her death belongs to you, and her honor and her service and her loyalty all flow to you as water flows to the sea." Thomas shook his head quickly, and Vexala saw something flash across his face that looked like horror. "No," he said firmly, "that is not something I want, and I did not agree to any of this. What you want is irrelevant," the elder said. "What you agreed to is irrelevant, and the law cares nothing for the wishes of those it binds." The elder sat back, down on its throne with the slow movements of great age. The Verkosh was thrown, and the Verkosh was caught, and the law of binding is fulfilled. The elder said, "This is the way it has been for 6,000 cycles, and this is the way it will remain." Thomas turned to look at Vexala, and she forced herself to meet his gaze, even though every instinct told her to look away in shame. "Commander," he said, and his voice was gentler than she expected, "is this true, and is there really no way to undo what has happened?" Vexala had to try 3 times before she could make her voice work. "It is true," she said, and each word felt like swallowing broken glass. "The law of binding is absolute, and no force in the known universe can break it." She gestured at the crowd around them with one shaking claw. "I am yours, now human," she said. "My life and my honor and my purpose all belong to you to do with as you see fit." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and then he did something that made no sense at all. He held out the spear toward her. "Take it back," he said. Vexala felt her secondary eyes blink in confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I am giving you your spear back," Thomas said. "I do not want to own anyone, and I do not want any of the things your elder just described. You cannot give it back." Vexala said, "The law does not work that way." "Then tell me how it does work," Thomas said, and there was a stubborn set to his jaw that she had not seen before. "Tell me everything, and we will find a way to fix this together." Vexala stared at him, and she could not understand what she was seeing. This human had just been handed absolute power over her, and he was trying to give it away. That was not how beings behaved when they were given power. That was not how anyone behaved. "Why?" she heard herself ask. "Why would you refuse what you have been given?" Thomas lowered the spear, but he did not put it down. "Because where I come from, we do not believe in owning people," he said. "We fought many wars over many centuries to establish that principle, and I am not going to abandon it just because I am in a different part of the galaxy." He looked up at the elder again. "There must be some alternative," he said. "Some other interpretation of the law that does not require anyone to be property." The elder made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. "You are a strange creature, human," the elder said. "In 6,000 cycles of the Verkosh law, no catcher has ever asked such a question. Then I am the first," Thomas said, "and I'm not going to stop asking until I get an answer." Vexala felt something stir in her chest that she did not recognize at first. It took her a moment to realize that it was the faintest flicker of hope no one had ever tried to free someone from the Verkosh bond, because no one had ever wanted to. The catchers always took what was offered, and they throwers always accepted their fate, because that was simply how things worked. But this human was refusing to accept anything. And he was standing in the middle of the most sacred arena on Cathara, Prime telling the elders that he wanted to change a law that was older than most civilizations in the galaxy. It was foolish and impossible and doomed to fail. And yet he meant it. She could see in his eyes that he truly meant every word he was saying. The elder was silent for a long time, and the crowd waited and watched with thousands of pairs of eyes. Finally, the ancient Sarani spoke again. "The law cannot be broken," it said, "but perhaps it can be interpreted differently than it has been interpreted before." Thomas stepped forward eagerly. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The original texts speak of binding and service and eternal loyalty," the elder said, "but they do not specify the exact nature of that service or the form that loyalty must take." The elder's pale eyes moved from Thomas to Vexala and back again. "For 6,000 cycles, we have assumed that the catcher becomes the master and the thrower becomes the servant," the elder said. "But the texts themselves do not use those words." Vexala felt her hearts begin to beat faster as she listened. "What words did the text use?" Thomas asked. "They speak of the bound pair as two who have become one," the elder said. "Two halves of a single purpose and two souls joined by the sacred spear." The elder leaned back on its throne, and its expression was unreadable. "Perhaps human," the elder said. "You are the first catcher to understand what Verkosh herself truly meant all those millennia ago." The arena fell silent again, and in that silence, Vexala felt the first crack appear in the wall of shame and despair that had surrounded her since the moment Thomas Reeve had caught her spear. She did not know yet what this crack would lead to, but for the first time since her world had fallen apart, she felt like maybe there was still something worth fighting for. She looked at the human who had caught her spear and refused to claim his prize, and she wondered what other impossible things he might do before this was over. The chambers they gave Thomas were simple but comfortable, and they were located in a quiet wing of the great palace that stood at the edge of the arena. Complex, the walls were made of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the furniture was built for beings with 4 legs rather than 2, which made sitting somewhat awkward, but Thomas had dealt with worse accommodations during his 20 years in the United Earth Defense Force, and he was not about to complain. About a few uncomfortable chairs, Vexilla stood near the door in the rigid pose of a soldier at attention, and she had not moved or spoken since they entered the room. 3 hours ago, Thomas had tried to talk to her several times, but she only gave short answers and refused to look directly at him. He understood that she was struggling with what had happened in the arena, and he did not want to push her too hard too fast, but they needed to talk about this situation eventually because it was not going to go away on its own. He picked up the tablet that the Serani administrators had given him, and he continued reading through the documents about the Verkash law. The more he learned, the less he liked what he was seeing. The law had been created 6,000 years ago, and in all that time, it had been invoked fewer than 100 times. Most of those times had been in the ancient past when the Serani still fought wars against each other on the surface of their homeworld. The last recorded invocation had been over 2,000 years ago, and it had ended with the thrower taking her own life rather than living in bondage. That story made Thomas feel sick to his stomach. The bond really cannot be dissolved. He asked again, hoping that maybe he had missed something in his reading. No, Vexilla said, and her voice was flat and empty. There is no appeal process or legal challenge or exception for special circumstances. No, what happens if I just publicly renounce the bond and declare that I release you from any obligation? This time, Vexilla was quiet for a long moment before she answered. That would be the worst thing you could do. She finally said. Thomas looked up from the tablet and frowned at her. Why would trying to free you be worse than keeping you bound? He asked. Vexilla finally turned to face him, and he could see the pain in her 4 eyes. If you renounce the bond, you would be declaring to my entire people that I am not worthy of keeping, she said. You would be saying that I am so worthless and so broken that even a soft human does not want me. She paused, and her claws tightened into fists at her sides. And I would be seen as someone who failed so completely that my own captor threw me away like garbage. She continued, the shame would fall not just on me, but on my entire bloodline for 1,000 generations. Thomas set down the tablet and leaned forward. What would happen to you? He asked quietly. I would most likely take my own life to restore some measure of honor to my family, Vexilla said, and she spoke the words as if she was describing the weather. It is what any Serani would do in such circumstances. Thomas felt a cold anger building in his chest. This entire system was designed to trap people in impossible situations. With no way out, if he kept the bond, he was a slave owner. If he rejected it, he was a murderer. And there seemed to be no middle ground between those two terrible options. That is not acceptable, he said firmly. There has to be another way. There is no other way, Vexilla said. The law is the law, and it has been the law for 6,000 years. Thomas stood up and began pacing across the room. Then we will make a new way, he said. Humans are good at that, and we have a long history of finding solutions to problems that everyone said were unsolvable. Vexilla watched him pace with an expression he could not quite read. You truly believe that, she said, and it was not a question. I have to believe it, Thomas said, because the alternative is something I cannot accept. He stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. I am not going to own you like property, he said, and I am not going to throw you away and let you destroy yourself. And I am not going to give up and accept that this situation cannot be changed. He took a step toward her and held her gaze with his own. So we are going to find another path, even if we have to carve it ourselves, he said, and I need you to help me do that because I cannot do it alone. Vexilla stared at him for a long moment, and he could see something shifting behind her eyes. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why do you care what happens to me, and why are you willing to fight against laws that are older than your entire species?" Thomas thought about the question carefully before he answered. "Because I have seen what happens when people treat other people as property," he said. "My own people did it for thousands of years, and it caused suffering beyond measure. And it took us a very long time to understand how wrong it was." He sat back down on the uncomfortable chair and looked up at her. "I joined the military to protect people who cannot protect themselves," he said. "And right now you are the one who needs protection, even if you are also one of the most dangerous warriors I have ever met." Vexala made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. "I threw the Verkash at you, and you caught it with your bare hand," she said. "I am clearly not as dangerous as you think." "You are exactly as dangerous as I think," Thomas said. "I just happen to have some advantages that you did not know about." Her secondary eyes narrowed with sudden interest. "What advantages?" she asked. "How did you catch the spear when no one has been able to catch it for 6,000 years? Thomas hesitated for a moment and then decided that honesty was the best approach. "My people are not naturally strong or fast compared to most species in the galaxy," he said. "We learned that very quickly when we first started exploring space and meeting other civilizations." He held up his hands and looked at them. "So we found ways to improve ourselves," he said. "We call it augmentation, and it involves surgery and genetic modification and technology woven into our bodies." Vexala's crest of feathers rose slightly with surprise. "You alter yourselves," she said, "deliberately and permanently, when we need to." Thomas said, "Most humans in our military have some level of augmentation, and mine is fairly extensive." He flexed his fingers and watched the way they moved. "My reflexes are about 4 times faster than an unaugmented human," he said. "My muscle fibers have been enhanced to be stronger and more responsive, and my eyes can track motion that would be invisible to normal vision." He looked up at her. "When you threw that spear, I saw it coming in what felt like slow motion," he said. "I had plenty of time to reach out and grab it." Vexala was quiet for a long time as she processed this information. "Your intelligence files did not mention anything about augmentation," she finally said. "I know," Thomas said. "We prefer to keep some of our capabilities secret, and we have found that other species tend to underestimate us because of how we look. You appear soft and weak and slow," Vexala said slowly, "and your enemies assume that is what you truly are, until it is too late for them to realize their mistake." Thomas finished. "Yes, exactly." Vexala's eyes narrowed, and he could see her reevaluating everything she thought she knew about humans. "You are not what I expected," she said. "Neither are you," Thomas replied. "I expected a mindless warrior who only cared about honor and killing, but instead, I see someone who is thoughtful and intelligent and suffering under a system she did not create." Vexala looked away, and he could see her struggling with his words. "I have spent 400 years believing that the Verkash law was just and right," she said quietly. "I have watched others be bound, and I have thought it was the natural order of things." She turned back to him, and her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "And now I am the one who is bound, and suddenly I can see how cruel it truly is," she said. "What does that say about me that I could not see it before?" Thomas stood up and walked over to stand beside her. "It says that you are capable of growth and change," he said gently, "which is more than most beings can claim in this universe." He reached out and touched her arm, and she flinched at first but did not pull away. "We cannot change the past," he said, "but we can try to build a different future, and that starts with finding a way to reinterpret this law of yours." Vexala looked at his hand on her arm and then looked at his face. "You really believe we can do this?" she said. "I know we can," Thomas said, "because we are going to do it together. For the first time since the arena, Vexala's posture relaxed slightly, and something that might have been a small smile crossed her alien features. Together, she repeated, "That is not how the Varkash bond is supposed to work. Then we will have to teach your people a new way." Thomas said, and in that moment Vexala began to believe that maybe this impossible human was right. 2 weeks had passed since the day in the arena, and Thomas Reeve was beginning to understand just how deep the rabbit hole went to Serani. Dominion was not just one planet, but a vast empire spanning hundreds of star systems and billions of citizens. And every single one of those citizens knew what had happened on Cathar Prime. The story had spread across their communication networks. Faster than light itself could travel, a human had caught the Verkasha. Soft, weak, short-lived human had done the impossible thing, and instead of claiming his prize, he was trying to give it away. Reactions were mixed and intense, and they seemed to grow more complicated with every passing days. Some Serani saw Thomas as a revolutionary hero who was challenging an unjust system that should have been abolished centuries ago. Others saw him as an abomination who was spitting on sacred traditions and insulting their ancestors. And still others were simply confused and uncertain about what any of this meant. For their society, Thomas sat in the library of the Great Palace, reading through ancient texts that the scholars had provided at his request. The original writings about the Varakash law were thousands of years old, and they had been copied and translated many times over the millennia. Was looking for any word or phrase that might support a different interpretation of the Bonvex. Alice sat across from him at the same table, and she was doing her own research through the military archive. She had explained that the warrior caste had their own traditions and records about the Varkash, and those records might contain information that the civil scholars did not have. They worked in comfortable silence, and Thomas found that he appreciated having her there. Over the past 2 weeks, they had spent many hours together talking and learning about each other. He had told her about Earth and human history and the long, painful journey his species had taken from primitive violence to something resembling civilization. She had told him about the Serani and their ancient culture and the Kulis complex web of honor and duty that governed every aspect of their lives. They were very different in so many ways, but Thomas was beginning to see that they also had more in common than he would have expected. Both of them had dedicated their lives to service. Both of them had sacrificed personal happiness for duty, and both of them were now trapped in a situation that neither of them had asked for or wanted. "I may have found something," Vexala said suddenly. Thomas looked up from his tablet and saw that her crest was raised with excitement. "What is it?" he asked. Vexala turned her tablet around so he could see the screen. "This is from the personal journal of a warrior named Kelthor, who lived about 3,000 years ago," she said. "He was present at the last recorded invocation of the Verkash before mine." Thomas leaned forward to look at the ancient text. Language was archaic and difficult to read, but the translation software was helping. "What does it say?" he asked. Kelthor witnessed the binding, and he wrote about what he saw, Vexala said. "But his account is different from the official records." She scrolled through the document and pointed at a specific passage. The official history says that the thrower became a slave to the catcher and served him until death, she said. But Kelthor writes that the relationship was more complicated than that. Thomas read the passage carefully. According to Kelthor, the bound pair had started as master and servant, but over time their relationship had evolved into something else. The catcher had come to rely on the thrower not just for service, but for counsel and companionship, and the thrower had found purpose and meaning in the bond that went beyond simple obedience. By the end of their lives, they were more like partners than owner and property. "This is exactly what I was looking for," Thomas said with growing excitement. "This shows that the bond can change and grow over time." "There is more," Vexala said, and she scrolled to another section. Kelthor asked the bound pair about their relationship near the end of their lives. and he recorded their answers. Thomas read the words on the screen and felt his heart beat faster. Thrower had said that the Verkosh had not made her a slave, it had made her part of something greater than herself, and the Catcher had said that catching the spear was not a conquest, was an invitation to build something together. This changes everything. Thomas said, if we can show the elders that the original bound pair saw their relationship this way, then we have a foundation for reinterpretation. Vexilla nodded, but her expression was cautious. The elders will not accept this easily, she said. They have built their authority on the traditional interpretation of the law, and they will not give that up without a fight. Then we will have to fight them. Thomas said, not with weapons, but with words and evidence and the truth of what the law was always meant to be. He stood up from the table and began pacing with renewed energy. We need to find more accounts like this one, he said. More evidence that the Verkosh bond was originally intended to be a partnership rather than ownership. The archives are vast, Vesala said. It could take years to search them all. Then we had better get started, Thomas said with a grin. Vexala looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. You are actually enjoying this, she said, and there was wonder in her voice. Thomas stopped pacing and considered her words. I suppose I am, he admitted. This is important work, and it could help a lot of people, not just us. He walked back over to stand beside her. Think about it, he said. If we can change the interpretation of the Verkosh law, we will be protecting every future generation from the suffering that you have experienced. Vexella was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded slowly. I had not thought of it that way, she said. I was only thinking about my own shame and dishonor, but you are right that this is bigger than just the two of us. It always is, Thomas said. The things we do always affect more people than we realize, and the choices we make ripple outward through time in ways we cannot predict. Vexala looked at him with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Was the look she got when she was seeing something in him that she did not expect. You are a philosopher as well as a soldier, she said. Thomas laughed softly. Not really, he said. I am just someone who has been alive long enough to see how my choices affect others. He sat back down at the table and picked up his tablet again. Now let us find more evidence, he said. We have a revolution to plan. They worked together through the rest of the day and into the night. Library lights dimmed automatically as the twin suns set outside, but neither of them noticed they were too focused on their search by the time they finally stopped to rest. They had found 7 more accounts from different eras that described the Verkosh bond in ways that contradicted the official interpretation. Not all of them were as clear as Kelther's journal, but together they painted a picture of a tradition that had been slowly distorted over thousands of years. This is enough to present to the High Council, Vexala said as she stretched her forelegs with a groan. They cannot ignore this much evidence. They can try, Thomas said, but we will not let them. He looked at her across the table and smiled. Thank you for your help today, he said. I could not have found all of this without you. Vexela's crest fluttered with an emotion he could not quite identify. You are my bonded, she said. Helping you is my duty. It is more than that, and you know it, Thomas said gently. You chose to help me because you believe in what we are doing. Vexala was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she finally admitted. I do believe in this. And I believe in you, Thomas Reeve. It was the first time she had used his first name, Thomas. Felt something warm bloom in his chest at the sound of it. Then we are partners in this, he said, just like the bound pairs in those old accounts. Vet his eyes, and for the first time since the arena she smiled. It was a small smile, and it looked strange on her alien features, but it was real. Partners, she repeated. I think I like that word. Thomas smiled back at her. So do I. The night before the council's decision was the longest night of Thomas Reeve's life. He lay on the uncomfortable Serrani bed in his chambers and stared at the ceiling while his mind raced through every possible outcome. What if they rejected his arguments completely? What if they punished him for daring to challenge their sacred traditions? What if they took Vexala away from him and gave her to someone who would treat her the way the old law intended? That last thought made his chest tighten. With an emotion he did not want to examine too closely, somewhere during the past weeks, something had changed between him and the alien warrior. He was not sure exactly when it had happened, but he knew that she had become important to him in a way that went beyond their shared mission. She was not just his partner in fighting for change. She was his friend, and maybe something more than that. A knock at his door pulled him out of his spiraling thoughts. "Enter." He called out. The door slid open, and Vexala stepped into the room. She looked different somehow, and it took Thomas a moment to realize that she was not wearing her usual military uniform. Instead, she wore simple flowing robes in a deep blue color that made her violet scales shimmer beautifully in the low light. "I could not sleep," she said, "and I thought perhaps you could not either." Thomas sat up and gestured at the chair across from his bed. "You thought right," he said. "Come in." Vexala moved into the room and settled onto the chair with the fluid grace that still amazed him. "I have been thinking about what tomorrow might bring," she said, "and I wanted to say some things while I still have the chance." Thomas felt his heart beat faster. What kind of things? Vexala was quiet for a moment, and her secondary eyes looked away from him as if she could not bear to meet his gaze. "Before you caught my spear, I was considered one of the finest warriors in the Dominion," she said. "I had everything I thought I wanted, and I had earned respect and honor through 4 centuries of service." She paused, and her claws tightened on the arms of the chair. "But I was also lonely in a way I did not understand until now," she continued. "The warrior's life is glorious, but it is also empty, and I filled the emptiness with duty and training and more duty." She finally looked at him, and her 4 eyes were bright with unshed tears. "When you caught the Verkosh, I thought my life was over," she said. "I thought I would be forced to serve a soft alien creature who would use me and discard me when I was no longer useful." Thomas wanted to speak, but he could see that she needed to finish. "Instead, I found something I never expected," she said. "I found someone who saw me as a person rather than a prize, and someone who fought for me when he had no reason to do so." She stood up from the chair and walked toward him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these weeks with you have meant more to me than the previous 4 centuries combined," she said. "You have given me something I did not know I was missing." Thomas stood to face her, and they were close enough now that he could feel the warmth radiating from her scaled skin. "What did I give you?" he asked softly. "Hope," Vexala said. "And something else that I do not have a word for in either of our languages." Thomas reached up and gently touched her face. Her scales were smoother than he expected and warm beneath his fingers. "I think I might have a word for it," he said. Vexala leaned into his touch, and her eyes closed. "Tell me." Thomas hesitated because what he was about to say would change everything between them. Then he realized that everything had already changed, and the only question was whether he was brave enough to admit it. "I think it might be love," he said. Vexala's eyes opened, and she stared at him with an expression he could not read. "Love," she repeated. "I know that word, and humans use it often in their stories and songs." "We do," Thomas said, "because it is the most important thing." "We know." Vexala reached up and covered his hand with her own. "Among my people, there is a similar concept," she said. "We call it the joining of souls, and it is said to be the rarest and most precious bond 2 beings can share." She moved even closer, and now their bodies were almost touching. "I thought it was just a legend," she said. "Something the old storytellers invented to make their tales more interesting. And now I think perhaps the legends were true after all." Thomas smiled and pulled her into his arms. She was taller than him, and her body was shaped differently, but somehow they fit together perfectly. Is this permitted between bound pairs? He asked. Vexala laughed softly against his shoulder. I have no idea, she said. There are no records of anything like this happening before. Then we will be the first, Thomas said, and we will make our own rules. They stood there, holding each other for a long time, while the stars wheeled overhead through the transparent ceiling. When they finally separated, Vexala looked at him with new warmth in her eyes. Whatever the council decides tomorrow, she said. I am already yours, Thomas Reeve, and you are already mine. Is that the Verkosh bond speaking? He asked. Vexala shook her head. No, she said. This is something different, and something more. She touched his face the way he had touched hers. This is choice, she said. The law bound our lives together, but we have chosen to bind our hearts as well. Thomas felt tears prick at his eyes, and he did not try to hide them. I choose you too, he said, now and always. Vexala smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Now and always, she repeated. They spent the rest of the night talking about everything and nothing about their hopes for the future and their fears about the morning, about the life they might build together if the council gave them the chance. When the twin suns finally rose over the mountains, they were still together, and for the first time since the arena, Thomas felt like maybe everything was going to be okay, because no matter what the council decided, he knew one thing for certain: he was exactly where he was supposed to be with exactly the person he was supposed to be with, and that was something no law or tradition could ever take away. The High Council chamber was even more crowded than it had been the day before. Word of the deliberations had spread across the planet, and thousands of Serani had gathered outside the mountain to await the decision inside the chamber. Every seat in the observation galleries was filled, and Thomas could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him as he walked to the center of the speaking floor. Vexala walked beside him, and their hands were clasped together in a way that made several of the observers gasp with shock. A bound pair showing affection in public was unheard of in traditional Serani culture, but they were not here to follow tradition. They were here to change it. The 12 elders sat upon their obsidian thrones, and their ancient faces revealed nothing of what they had decided. Chief Elder Verzana rose from her seat, and the chamber fell instantly silent. We have deliberated through the night, she announced, and her voice rolled across the vast space like thunder. The evidence presented by the human Thomas Reeve and Commander Vexala has been examined and debated at great length. Thomas felt Vexala's grip tighten on his hand, and he squeezed back reassuringly. The question before us was whether the Verkosh law, as it has been interpreted for thousands of years, truly reflects the intentions of our ancestor Verkosh herself. Versana paused, and Thomas could not tell from her expression what she was about to say. We have reviewed the ancient texts and the historical accounts and the journals of those who witnessed previous invocations of the law, she continued, and we have come to a conclusion that surprised even ourselves. The chamber was so quiet that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The evidence clearly shows that the interpretation of the Verkosh law has drifted over time from its original meaning. Versana said, what began as a sacred bond between equals became twisted into a relationship of master and servant. Thomas felt hope surge in his chest. This corruption was gradual and unintentional, but it was corruption nonetheless. Versana said, and it has caused untold suffering to generations of bound pairs who deserve better from their traditions. She looked directly at Thomas and Vexala. The human asked us to officially recognize that the Verkosh bond can be one of equal partnership rather than ownership, she said, and after much deliberation, we have decided to grant this recognition. The chamber erupted in sound cheers, and shouts and cries of outrage, all mixed together in a chaotic roar that filled the vast space. Versana raised her hand, and slowly the noise subsided. Furthermore, she continued, we have decided to offer all currently bound pairs the choice of how they wish to define their relationship going forward. More outcry from the galleries, but Versana ignored it. And finally, we have decided to create a new position within the Dominion to oversee the implementation of these changes. She gestured at Thomas and Vexala. We offer this position jointly to the human Thomas Reeve and Commander Veshala as the first officially recognized equal partnership under the reformed Verkosh law. Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief, and he would have staggered if Vexala had not held him up. We accept, Veshala said, and her voice was strong and clear. We will serve the Dominion and all bound pairs to the best of our abilities. Versana smiled, and it transformed her ancient face into something warm and almost motherly. Then it is done, she said. Let the record show that on this day the Verkosh law was restored to its true meaning, and a new era began for the Serani people. The cheers that followed were louder than before, and this time there were fewer voices raised in opposition. Thomas looked at Vexala and saw tears streaming down her scaled cheeks. He pulled her into his arms right there in front of the entire council and the galleries full of observers. She held him back just as tightly. We did it. He whispered against her shoulder. We did it, she agreed. Together, when they finally separated, Admiral Chun's face appeared on a holographic screen that materialized beside them. Thomas had almost forgotten that the United Earth diplomatic team had been watching the proceedings remotely. Congratulations, Sergeant Major, Chun said, and she was smiling wider than Thomas had ever seen her smile. You just started a revolution. It was not just me, Thomas said. I had help. He looked at Vexala and she nodded at the Admiral. It was a joint effort, Vexala said, as all things should be between partners. Chun laughed. The diplomatic implications of this are going to take years to sort out, she said. But for now, just enjoy your victory and we will talk about the details later. The screen disappeared, and Thomas found himself surrounded by Serani, who wanted to congratulate him and shake his hand and touch the human who had changed their world. It was overwhelming, but Vexala stayed by his side through all of it when they finally escaped the chamber. Hours later, the twin suns were setting behind the mountains. They stood together on a balcony overlooking the vast city that spread below them, and they watched the sky turn colors that humans did not have names for. What happens now? Vexala asked. Thomas thought about the question. Now we have work to do, he said. There are other bound pairs out there who need to know that they have choices, and there will be resistance from those who preferred the old ways. He looked at her and smiled. But we will face it together. Vexala leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. The elders said we are the first officially recognized equal partnership, she said. Do you know what that means? Tell me. It means we are writing the rules for everyone who comes after us, she said. Our partnership will be the model that others follow. Thomas considered that responsibility. Then we had better get it right, he said. Vexala laughed, and the sound was warm and beautiful. I have no doubts that we will, she said. After all, we have proven that we can do impossible things when we work together. Thomas kissed the top of her head and felt her press closer to him. This is just the beginning, he said. Yes, Vexala agreed, and I cannot wait to see what comes next. Below them, the city lights were beginning to flicker on one by one as night fell. Above them, the stars were emerging from the darkening sky, and all around them a new future was taking shape, a future built on partnership and equality, and the stubborn human belief that anything was possible if you refused to give up. Thomas Reeve had come to Serani space by accident. He had caught a spear he was never supposed to catch, and in doing so, he had found something he never expected to find at Tay. Purpose, a partner, a home, and that was worth more than all the traditions in the galaxy. The High Council chamber was the most impressive room Thomas had ever seen in his life. It was carved directly into the heart of a mountain, and its walls rose hundreds of meters to a domed ceiling that showed the stars through transparent crystal. 12 obsidian thrones circled the central speaking floor, and each throne held an elder so ancient that they made the sin. One from the arena seemed young by comparison. Thomas stood in the center of the room with Vexala at his side, and he could feel the weight of thousands of years of history pressing down on him from every direction. The chief elder was named Versana, and she was said to be the oldest living Sarani. At nearly 2,000 years of age, her scales had faded to pure white, and her eyes glowed with an inner light that Thomas did not understand. "You come before us with an unusual request, human," Versana said, and her voice echoed through the chamber like the sound of distant thunder. "You wish to challenge the interpretation of our most sacred law." "I do," Thomas said, and he was proud that his voice did not shake. "With the permission of the council, I wish to present evidence that the Vokush law has been misunderstood for thousands of years." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, and several of the elders shifted on their thrones. "This is unprecedented," said another elder whose name Thomas did not know. "No outsider has ever been permitted to speak on matters of sacred law." "With respect," Thomas said, "I am not just an outsider, and the Vokush bond makes me part of your society, whether any of us wanted it or not." More murmurs, and some of them sounded angry. Vorsan raised one clawed hand, and the chamber fell silent. "The human speaks truth," she said. "By the law, he is now bound to Commander Vexala, and through her, he is connected to the Sarani people." She leaned forward on her throne, and her glowing eyes fixed on Thomas with uncomfortable intensity. "Speak then, human," she said. "Present your evidence, and we shall judge its merit." Thomas took a deep breath, and he told him about the ancient accounts he and Vexala had found in the archives. He told them about Kelther's journal and the bound pairs who had described their relationship as partnership rather than ownership. He told them about the original texts and how the words used could be interpreted in more than one way. He spoke for almost an hour, and he could see the expressions on the elders' faces shifting as he talked. Some of them looked skeptical, and some looked angry, but some of them looked thoughtful, and a few even looked hopeful. When he finished speaking, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then one of the elders spoke up. "Even if your interpretation is correct, human, what would you have us do about it?" Thomas had prepared for this question. "I am not asking you to abolish the Vokush law," he said. "I know that it is too important to your culture and your history for that." He gestured at Vexala, who stood silent and proud beside him. "I am asking you to officially recognize that the bond can be one of equal partnership rather than ownership," he said. "I am asking you to give future bound pairs the choice of how they wish to define their relationship." Another elder spoke. "And what of the bonds that already exist under the traditional interpretation?" "Those bonds were entered into under the old understanding, and I would not presume to change them against the wishes of those involved," Thomas said. "But perhaps you could offer them the same choice that I am asking for myself and Commander Vexala." Versana leaned back on her throne and closed her eyes. Other elders waited in respectful silence while she considered what she had heard. Minutes passed, and Thomas could feel sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool air of the chamber. Finally, Versana opened her eyes and spoke. "I have lived for nearly 2,000 years, and in all that time I have never seen anyone challenge the Vokush law." She paused, and her gaze moved to Vexala. "Commander, what say you in this matter?" Vexala stepped forward, and Thomas could see the tension in every line of her body. "Before the arena, I would have said that the traditional interpretation was the only correct one," she said. "I was raised to believe that the bound serve the binder, and that there is honor in such service." She paused, and Thomas could see her gathering her courage. "But I have spent the past weeks with Thomas Reeve and I have seen something that I did not expect to see, she continued. I have seen a being who was given absolute power over another, and who refused to use it. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. He did not treat me as property, or as a slave, or even as a servant, she said. He treated me as an equal from the very first moment, and he has fought alongside me to find a better way. She turned to look at Thomas, and her eyes were bright with emotion. If that is what the Verkesh bond can be, then I am proud to be part of it, she said. And I believe that is what Verkesh herself intended when she first swore loyalty to the one who caught her spear. The chamber was silent again, and Thomas could feel the moment. Balanced on the edge of a blade then. Prasanna smiled. It was a small smile, and it barely moved the ancient scales of her face, but Thomas saw it clearly in 2000. Years I have learned many things, Prasanna said. But the most important lesson I have learned is that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. She rose from her throne, and the other elders rose with her. A council will deliberate on this matter, she said. Return tomorrow, and you will have our answer. Thomas bowed his head in respect. Thank you for hearing us, he said. Do not thank us yet, human, Prasanna said. The decision has not been made, but there was something in her eyes that gave Thomas hope. As they left the chamber, Vexala walked close beside him. You did well, she said quietly. Better than I expected. We did well, Thomas corrected her. This was a team effort. Vexala made that sound again that might have been a laugh. You are determined to share everything equally, are you not? That is kind of the whole point, Thomas said with a grin. They walked together through the corridors of the great palace, and Thomas realized that somewhere along the way they had fallen into step with each other. Their strides matched perfectly, despite the difference in the number of their legs. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. What will you do if the council decides against us? Vexala asked. Thomas thought about the question. Keep fighting, he said. Keep looking for other ways to change things, and if there are no other ways, then we will create new ones, Thomas said. That is what humans do when we are told something is impossible. Vexala stopped walking, and Thomas stopped beside her. I believe you, she said. And that is perhaps the strangest thing of all. She reached out and touched his arm with one clawed hand. Whatever the council decides, I want you to know that I am grateful, she said. You have shown me that there is another way to live, and another way to understand honor. Thomas covered her hand with his own. We are not done yet, he said. The council will make the right choice, and I know it. How can you be so certain? Thomas smiled. Because the truth is on our side, and truth has a way of winning in the end. Vexala looked at him for a long moment, and then she nodded. I hope you. All right, Thomas Reeve, she said. For both our sakes, Thomas squeezed her hand gently. Trust me, he said, and to his surprise she did. 5 years had passed since the council's decision, and the galaxy was a different place than it had been before. Thomas Reeve stood on the balcony of the new partnership center on Cathara Prime and looked out at the city that had become his home. The building behind him was the headquarters of the Verkesh Partnership Initiative, and it was filled with counselors and advocates and scholars who worked every day to help bound pairs across the Dominion understand their rights and choices. In 5 years, they had helped over 300 pairs redefine their relationships. Some had chosen to remain in traditional arrangements because that was what they preferred, but many others had embraced the new interpretation and built partnerships of equality and mutual respect. The suicide rate among bound pairs had dropped by 90%. That single statistic meant more to Thomas than all the awards and honors that had been heaped upon him. Vexala emerged from the building and walked across the balcony to stand beside him. She looked different now than she had when they first met. The rigid military posture had softened, and she carried herself with a confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was worth. The Terran delegation has arrived, she said. They are waiting in the main conference room. Thomas nodded, but did not move right away. Do you remember what I said to you the night before the council's decision? He asked, and Vexala smiled. You said you thought what we felt might be love. She replied, and what do you think now after 5 years? Vexala took his hand and laced her clawed fingers through his. I think you were right, she said. And I think love is not a strong enough word for what we have built together. Thomas squeezed her hand and turned to face the conference room. Then let us go meet the delegation and continue building. The Terran delegation was led by Admiral Chun herself, who had been promoted twice since the events on Cathar Prime. She greeted Thomas with a warm handshake and Vexala with the traditional Serani gesture of respect between equals. It is good to see you both looking so well, Chum said. The reports from the initiative have been impressive. We have had help, Thomas said. The elders have been surprisingly supportive once they saw the positive results. Speaking of the elders, Chum said, Chief Elder Versana asked me to deliver a message. Thomas raised an eyebrow. What message? Chum smiled. She said to tell you that the ancestors are pleased with the path you have carved and that they look forward to welcoming you both when your journey is complete. Vexalis. Crest rose with surprise. That is a great honor, she said. The blessing of the ancestors is not given lightly. No, it is not, Chun agreed. Which brings me to the purpose of this delegation. She gestured, and one of her aides stepped forward carrying an ornate box. The United Earth Government has been watching the progress of the initiative closely, Chun said, and they believe that the model you have created here could be applied to other situations across the galaxy. Thomas felt a familiar tingle of anticipation. What kind of situations? There are other species with similar traditions of binding and servitude, Chun explained. Some of them have expressed interest in reforming their practices, but they do not know how to begin. She opened the box and revealed a beautiful medallion, carved from crystal that seemed to glow with inner light. We would like to appoint you both as special ambassadors for partnership rights, she said. Your mission would be to travel to these other civilizations and share what you have learned here. Thomas looked at Vexala and saw his own excitement reflected in her eyes. We would be honored, Vexala said, on one condition. Thomas, added Chun, tilted her head. What condition? We do this as partners, Thomas said. Equal authority and equal responsibility for both of us, Chun laughed. I would not have it any other way, she said. The whole point is to show other species what true partnership looks like. She handed the medallion to Thomas and he immediately passed it to Vexala, who looked at it with wonder. This is real, Vexala said softly. We are going to help other people the way we helped the Serani, the way we helped each other. Thomas corrected her. Vexala looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with emotion. Yes, she agreed. The way we helped each other. The ceremony that evening was attended by dignitaries from both civilizations, and it was broadcast across the Dominion and the human territories. Alike Thomas and Vexala stood together on the stage and accepted their appointment as the first joint ambassadors in galactic history. In his speech, Thomas talked about the day in the arena when everything had changed. I caught a spear that I was never supposed to catch, he said, and in doing so, I gained something far more valuable than any victory in combat. He looked at Vexala and smiled. I gained a partner, he said, a friend and a love that has taught me more about what it means to be truly connected to another being than I ever knew was possible. He turned back to the audience. The old ways taught that the strong should dominate the weak and that bonds should be chains rather than bridges, he said, but we have proven that there is another way. He took Vexala's hand and raised it high. We have proven that true strength comes from lifting each other up rather than pushing each other down, he said, and we will spend the rest of our lives sharing that message with anyone who will listen. The applause that followed was thunderous, and it seemed to shake the very walls of the great hall later. That night, Thomas and Vesala stood alone on the balcony of their home and looked up at the stars. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked. "It will mean leaving everything we have built here." Vesala considered the question. "We are not leaving it behind," she said. "We are taking it with us and spreading it across the galaxy." She turned to face him, and her 4 eyes gleamed in the starlight. "Besides," she said, "my home is not this place or any place. Where is your home, then?" Vesala stepped close and wrapped her arms around him. "My home is wherever you are," she said. That is what the Verkosh truly meant all along. Thomas held her tight and felt the truth of her words settle into his heart. "Then let us go home together," he said. "Wherever the stars take us." Vesala smiled against his chest. "Now and always," she said. "Now and always," he agreed. And somewhere out in the vast darkness of space, the ancestors watched and smiled, because this was exactly what they had planned when they forged the first spear all those millennia ago. Not a weapon of domination, but a bridge between souls. Not a chain, but a bond freely chosen and freely given. The Verkosh had finally found its true purpose, and so had the two beings whose lives it had joined together. This was not an ending, it was a beginning, and the best adventures were still waiting to be written. The end.